Hey guys, some of you who are thinking of living long term in Japan might get some useful information from this, some options for some cheap accommodation. Other people might just find this interesting because this is what you are likely to see if you come to Japan. Pretty much all the big cities and often just even towns will have areas like this that are full of government housing. So there's a program in Japan called the UR program, or the Urban Renaissance program, that was started about 60 years ago, and it was to provide public housing and to try and give accommodation to people who wanted to live in the cities. So you'll quite often come across areas like this, of just rows and rows and rows of these buildings. So that often they are administered by the local prefecture, although over the years different prefectures have had different situations. So sometimes they'll be privately owned now, sometimes they'll be owned by companies that have bought them and perhaps renovated them and rented them out. Other times the individual apartments will have been sold off and they'll be controlled by body corporates. So there's all sorts of different combinations of administration involved with these now, and as a result of that, all sorts of different conditions. So sometimes you'll see them like these that are reasonably well maintained. It just depends on how much time and money is spent on maintaining them. Sometimes they can look quite nice and quite well maintained and the gardens around them are quite nice. Other times they can be pretty depressing. Some of the ones where they don't upkeep them very well, they can be quite depressing. Obviously the outsides in the gardens, but also the insides as well. Sometimes over the years the plumbing's deteriorated in the walls and that leads to leaks, and so they can be pretty horrific inside. It just depends on how well they were built, how long ago, how well maintained they are, of course. So sometimes they've managed to keep them in pretty good order, other times they've let them go. Sometimes they'll give up on them, and we'll sometimes see whole blocks like this deserted. So here's an example of that, actually out in the middle of rice fields, the middle of nowhere. The nearest city is a little town, and this has been built. There must have been some sort of factory nearby or something, and these two were built out in the middle of nowhere. And then something obviously has changed in the past, so wherever these people worked or whatever has changed, and now this place is deserted. So it's really strange because just out in the middle of the rice fields you can see it from miles away, and then when you get up close like this, it's just, as you can see, fenced and deserted. So that's not uncommon. We've seen lots like this that are just fenced off and closed off, because they're hugely expensive to demolish, of course, because they're all concrete. And there's another example. If you look on the left here, see there's all these buildings on the right. If you look to the left of where we're driving, see the empty space? They'll sometimes do that too. Sometimes there'll be one building or two buildings that they've sort of lost control of. Somehow it's got out of hand, maybe water leaks or foundation problems or something like that. It's just got too out of hand and they'll just demolish them. So you'll often see that too. You'll have noticed by now the buildings have numbers on them. It's sort of unfortunate. It's sort of logical, isn't it? You really have to have a number or a letter on there. It's logical, but it's sort of a bit depressing with the numbers on the building, isn't it? Block 34, block 97. Where do you live? I live in block 97, room 510. It's sort of depressing, isn't it? But it's inevitable, of course. But what's interesting is you'll often see rows of numbers where there's just numbers missing, and that's just because they've demolished different ones over the years because they've lost them. They weren't worth repairing. So most prefectures have a low income special thing. So in other words, if you are, your rent will be scaled to your income. So this isn't always the case, but it's often the case. It's what they would, not only for low income people, of course, anybody can live in these things, but they want to help, the government wants to help low income people by scaling their rent. So if you have low income, they can scale the rent to give you the rent cheaper, which is obviously very helpful for older people and other people who are low income for different reasons. So you can, if you're coming to Japan to live for a few years, you can apply for one of these, and usually the demand for these is lower than the supply. So in other words, there's usually a lot of these available around the place, so it's not hard to get into them. The other thing is, we've talked before about renting in Japan and about how there's key money and all sorts of fees and things involved, and it's quite expensive just to move into a place. Whereas with these, the ones that are still government controlled, there's no key money and there's no letting fees and there's nothing else. All there is the bond, which is normally 3 months? It's a percentage of the rent, or a multiple of the rent, and it's a bond, which means that if you leave the place in good condition, you get it back at the end, which basically means it's costing you nothing to move in. You're only got to pay the rent, which is pretty rare in Japan. Usually there's lots and lots of costs involved in renting a place. So that in itself saves you lots of money. So it might be an option for some people. There's an agency that is English friendly that administers a lot of these, or helps people get into these. So we'll put a link underneath this video in the information. So anybody who's interested in finding out more about these or applying to rent one can have a look at that. So it can be really cheap. Just one last thing too. We've mentioned on previous videos that if someone dies in a house or an apartment in Japan, after that, usually people don't want to live in it. And there's actually a law in Japan that if someone's died by suicide or murder, that the people have to tell anybody who's considering renting or buying the place. It's a law. These guys take it one step further. They will tell you if someone has died, because obviously a lot of old people live in these things, which means that it's inevitable that because a lot of older people have been living in these for 20 or 30 years, obviously it means lots of older people have died in these. So they will actually give you up to half price rent for a year or two if you're willing to rent an apartment that somebody's died in. So, natural causes, right? Somebody's died of old age, and if you're prepared to live in that apartment, they'll often give you half price rent. So instead of maybe hachiman a month or $800 a month, it might be $400 a month. So if you're not superstitious or worried about ghosts or things like that, that might be worth considering too if you want to get some cheap rent. Creepy way to finish a video. Sorry about that. More videos coming soon.